So the big proposal on the table is that the Resource Management Act will be repealed and replaced with 3 acts that will do similar to what the RMA does, but also a lot more. So it's not just a new RMA, it's the sort of RMA plus plus, if you like. The main act that is kind of the new traditional RMA is this Natural and Built Environments Act. Then there's a new concept called the Strategic Planning Act that I'll talk a little bit about, and another new concept, the Climate Change Adaptation Act, which has got a real RMA environmental focus rather than just emissions reduction. The main reasons that the government said we need reform, you'll be familiar with some of them if you've been in Queenstown for a bit. There is environmental degradation that's not meant to be happening. Water quality's still going down in a lot of areas, even around here. And biodiversity's still reducing. There's more threatened species becoming threatened. So the RMA is not doing its job in that space. Anyone who is living in Queenstown for a while, you know that urban development's not keeping pace with demand for housing, and infrastructure's not keeping pace, whether it's our water infrastructure or our roads. There's now an accepted urgency that we need to both deal with carbon emissions but also adapt to the effects of climate change that we're seeing now. There's also much more explicit acceptance that the role of Māori and the treaty under the RMA has not worked as it should have, and there's big changes to fix that. And then there's just the general efficiency and effectiveness of the current regime. Anybody who's been involved in the district plan process in Queenstown or applied for a resource consent, often that process seems to take a lot longer than it should and feels like it's costing a lot more than it should. And so those sorts of experiences are the new regimes intended to try and mitigate. So this is a bit of an overview of the process. The report from the Randerson group came out mid last year, and what the government did was release an exposure draft of just the Natural Built Environment Act in the middle of this year, and that went through a round of consultation, and the select committee's currently looking at it. And then there will be bills for both the Natural Built Environment Act and the Strategic Planning Act notified probably next year. Or it won't be this year, it will be next year, and they're aiming to have them in law by the end of this parliamentary term. This Climate Change Adaptation Act won't probably be notified until 2023. And when I tell you what it's about, you'll understand why that can sort of happen a bit later. And like I said, one of the main problems of the RMA that this new act is fixing is having a suite of mandatory national direction that's going to be put in place. The intention is that will be in place within the first 3 years that the Act is in place. And realistically, the transition period for all of us in the districts and the regions, when there'll be new instruments in place, it's going to take at least 10 years for everything to change. So there's going to be a long transition period, and we don't actually know what that will really look like yet. We don't have much detail about that. But that, when you're planning your own business or whatever, that's something that's going to become relevant to think about. Do you get on and do something now, or do you wait? So like I say, we saw this thing called an exposure draft. That's kind of a new concept. We haven't had many exposure drafts before, and it's probably, I reckon, about a fifth of what the actual full act will end up looking like. So there are a lot of gaps, but it had a lot of the detail in it that was helpful to see. And there was a submission process, so we helped lots of people put in submissions. They ran the select committee process, mainly virtually, because a lot of it happened when we were all locked down in, was it July? And then the select committee report on that first round of consultation is going to come out on the 1st of November. So that's going to be really interesting for those of us who are getting buried in the detail, because that'll give us a pretty clear steer on what the full bill is going to look like. So some of the key features of the exposure draft that might change as a result of that first round of consultation. The purpose of the Act looks quite different, uses quite different words to the purpose of the Resource Management Act. The key purpose is to uphold te oranga o te taio, which is the natural environment. mainly, and it's got these sort of sub-purposes about protecting and enhancing the natural environment, about tied up in the oranga o te taio is the intrinsic relationship between iwi and hapu and the natural environment. It's explicit that the interconnectedness of all parts of the natural environment has to be sort of wrapped into all the considerations. And it talks about the essential relationship between the health of the natural environment and its capacity to sustain life. It doesn't forget about people generally, though, as well. It also talks about ensuring that present generations can look after their well-being whilst not compromising the well-being of our future generations. So all very lofty. Another key feature that I touched on right at the start is there's a requirement that any decisions made under the new Act must give, and processes, equally as importantly, must give effect to the principles of the treaty. That's a big change from what the RMA says, which is that decision makers have to take into account the principles of the treaty. So that's the give effect to is the strongest test you can have in this sort of piece of legislation. Take into account means you just take it into account, but you don't necessarily have to fully implement it. This word give effect to is the same word that's used in the Conservation Act now. And if any of you kind of work in that space, you might be aware that there's a big shake-up, because up until recently it seems to be that DOC has not quite properly been giving effect to principles of the treaty in all of its decision-making processes. And there was a Supreme Court decision, I think, up north that's sort of spelt that out. So DOC's in a big process of recalibrating how it works with its relevant treaty partners in each of the regions, whether it's in respect of national park management plans. So we'll see, I think, a big difference in Fiordland with and the Milford's Opportunity Project, with the role of Ngāi Tahu down there, and even in concession applications, there's a difference now in how DOC are processing concession applications and requiring at what stage involvement of the relevant mana whenua. But those 4 bullet points there, the utmost good faith, informed decisions, not impeding capacity to provide for redress for a grievance, and actively promoting Māori interests, those are the principles in a nutshell, in very brief form. So what we'll see, I think, in terms of decision-making processes in particular, mana whenua and tangata whenua will be at the table much earlier, if not at the start of the process, rather than being consulted a lot later than they are at the moment. And they'll have formal roles on some key decision-making bodies. Some other key features of the exposure draft that I'll expand on each of these 4 points, but there's going to be much clearer black and white environmental limits set. There's also going to be a requirement for much better articulated outcomes that are to be planned for and planned towards. There'll be this, the mandatory national direction that I talked about is going to be called the National Planning Framework, and there's going to be a significant reduction in the number of plans that you have to deal with. At the moment, there's over 100 plans, regional policy statements and plans in the country. The intention is that there will just be 14 once that sort of transition period has been completed. So a big reduction in paperwork, but a big change to get to that point. So firstly, talking about limits, like I say, it's going to be mandatory that there'll be national direction to prescribe these environmental limits. Under the RMA, the only mandatory national direction is the Coastal Policy Statement, the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. And for ages, that was the only national direction the RMA had. And then eventually, there was the Freshwater National Policy Statement, the Renewable Energy one, the Electricity Transmission. So eventually, or air quality. So, there's some national direction now, but there's still no national direction on terrestrial biodiversity, habitats and ecosystems. There's no particular national direction on estuaries. There's a draft national policy statement on soil, but it's not been put into effect yet. So there's still some really big gaps, which the new Act will require to be remedied. And then there's this really brand new concept called environmental outcomes. And this is, there's again a set of required things Some of them are these more biophysical things or cultural outcomes that are to be required. But what I've listed on these slides are the ones that are sort of more, if you like, development focused, like proactive development focused. And that was something that was really missing from the RMA, is requiring councils to plan ahead for an outcome. There was nothing stopping councils from doing that, but there was nothing requiring them to do it. And so a lot of councils ended up taking the more effects-based approach and just managing effects rather than planning forwards. And so that's quite a flip, I think, between the current regime we've been dealing with and the new regime, is that it's going to make people think forwards rather than enabling them to if they feel like it. So some of the things that will be required to be prescribed at a national level and at a district and regional level is reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. This point about urban areas, each council will have to articulate how it's going to have well-functioning urban areas with resilient urban form and good transport links. So none of it's surprising. For housing supply, the keywords are providing choice, contributing to affordability, meeting diverse and changing needs, and supporting Māori housing aims. In rural areas, one of the things that still, like I said, is still missing in the national direction in terms of highly productive land. We don't have national direction yet on that, but that's focused on quite strongly in both the environmental outcomes and also the national planning framework. Infrastructure and renewable energy are big ones, and we will see much greater focus going forwards on natural hazards, managed retreat, effects of climate change and so on. So this national planning framework, or in our RMA language, national policy statements and national environmental standards, it's going to be for matters that are all of national significance and where it's desirable to have consistency across the country. The national planning framework instruments can contain every kind of mechanism you can think of, ranging from policies through to prescriptive rules that apply straight away across the country, through to standardising methods for doing things. So whether that's the method for determining if something's significant ecologically, or a method for calculating, air shed pollution, all those sorts of things, so that where it's sensible to, it's standardised across the country. So the list there are the mandatory topics that there will be national direction on within the first 3 years, and it's a really ambitious list. Areas where they haven't even done much work, like climate change and natural hazards, there's nothing on natural hazards at the moment that I'm aware of that they can sort of pull out and go, hey, here you go, let's consult on this for a bit, and now that's in force. Outstanding natural features and landscapes, a national policy statement on that will be, hugely relevant to this district. Urban areas and housing supply, that's something every year there seems to be a new act that's trying to fix those issues. And again, ecological integrity and areas of significant Indigenous vegetation and habitats. There's a draft national policy statement on biodiversity that's been consulted on, had submissions, I don't think they had a hearing, but it's still not been released. They were meant to release a sort of a next exposure draft mid this year. Didn't come out. I'm not sure why. I'm not in the tent enough to know the reason for that. But when that comes out, there's been a lot of controversy up in Northland and in other places about, identifying on private land areas of biodiversity that are significant. So I think that's possibly what's slowed down the government, but it's coming, and it will have implications for anybody who's got land that's got those sorts of habitats on it. So as I said, we've got over 100 plans at the moment, and the new framework will just have 14. That's a really big difference. So Auckland's like a model at the moment of what that looks like. They've got a unitary plan, so it's got the regional policy statement, all of the regional planning things, and then all of the district plan things, but all in one document. It was all decided in one process in front of one panel that made all the decisions. To put that in context, in Otago, we've got a regional policy statement. We've got an air plan, a water plan, a waste plan, and then we've got all the district plans. So all of that will become one beast. The process for making plans will be incredibly different if it stays similar to what the exposure draft was. So, at the moment the regional council makes its plans, district councils make their plans, they can submit on each other's plans and take each other to court. The new process will have one planning committee for Otago. Each council will have a representative on that planning committee, and there's no guidance about whether that's a staff member or a politician or a consultant. And Mana Whenua will also have a place on this regional planning committee, as will the Minister of Conservation. And the role of the planning committee is to, first of all, to sort of write the first draft of the plan. I presume they don't have to do it by themselves, they can pay some people to help them. And then it gets handed over to an independent hearings panel to notify it for submissions, hear submissions, have a hearing and make recommendations. That committee, then that goes back to the planning committee, and that committee can either accept or reject those recommendations. And it's not the details, not in the exposure draft yet, but what the Randerson report hinted at is that whatever the outcome is of that process, any appeal rights are only in the High Court. So and this is something that personally concerns me, not because I like litigation, even though it's my job. It concerns me that you're going straight to a not specialist court, because there are judges in the High Court that aren't specialists in environmental things and in this type of law. And it worries me that we're going to have a brand new act with some brand new tests and not have our specialist court be the court that starts to, make some guidance on those things. So I think a lot of people pointed that out to the Select Committee during the exposure draft process, so it'd be interesting to see what the Select Committee comes back with as a result of that. So really different process, very different role for each council. If you think about how hands-on the Queenstown District Council is at the moment with its district plan, it's going to be completely different going forwards if this model is what gets put in place. And the plans will contain what you'd expect them to contain. They'll implement all of the national direction, they'll have all of the locally relevant environmental limits, they'll have all these forward-looking great environmental outcomes that we're going to plan towards, and then all your resource consents get considered under those. So those are probably the 14 regions that will have one of these plans in place for each region. As well as all that, there's this new beast called the Strategic Planning Act proposed that's going to set up another different instrument called regional spatial strategies. And some of you might be aware that Queenstown not too long ago went through the process of creating its own spatial plan for the district to help it with longer term planning, where it's intended that future development be, so that infrastructure can be planned for, and so on and so forth. So it's a similar concept to that, but on a regional scale. And we don't have much detail about this because there was no exposure draft, so this is all just coming out of the Randerson report and various bits and bobs from the government. But it's basically at that regional scale with a sort of a 30-year horizon, picking areas that are appropriate for development, the no-go areas because of either managed retreat or natural hazards or increased effects of climate change, planning infrastructure, and that's not just sort of roads and pipes. I think that's meant to incorporate hospitals and schools and prisons, like all that sort of stuff. And it's somehow going to also integrate with the Local Government Act and the Land Transport Management Act. So, it sounds like a sensible thing to do, obviously, and that act is intended, I think, to be notified at a similar time as the Natural Built Environment Act. So both of those bills we might see next year, and they'd be in law by the end of the year. Current intention is that they're developed. You don't just let the region go off and develop it by itself. There's going to be some sort of collaboration with central and local government and Mana Whenua to develop those. Like I say, the timeline's 30 plus years, but also 100 years in terms of climate change responses. And they'll be implemented both through the natural and built environment plans, so they'll get their teeth in the natural and built environment plans, as well as your local government planning and your Land Transport Management Act planning. So several agencies effectively will be responsible for implementing the regional spatial strategies, not just councils. So if you boiled it down to little boxes, these are what the little boxes look like. And what's another thing that's quite important from my point of view that's not in the detail yet is the sequence that each of these things happens in or is allowed to happen in. Because if they don't control the sequence, we'll end up a little bit like we did with the RMA, with councils needing to move on, not having the relevant national or regional direction and having to reinvent the wheel themselves. So in order to avoid that, I say, there needs to be a prescription that, first we get the national planning framework in place, and then you get your regional spatial strategy in place, and then you get on with your natural and built environment plans. Because otherwise you're going to be wasting a whole lot of time getting your natural built environment plan in place and then having to redo it when the national direction's in place or the regional spatial strategy says something different. So if this is to be an efficient thing, managing that sequence is something that's quite important. But again, that kind of puts the brakes on things for a while at a local level. So what do you do about that? I don't know the answer to that. And finally, the third main act that they're proposing is the Climate Change Adaptation Act. And this is sort of the nuts and bolts and how to ensure everything's done fairly in terms of managed retreat and climate change adaptation. So it sounds like it's going to be mostly about how to fund the managed retreat, how to ensure people aren't, left out, and how to help councils and communities adapt. So yeah, it's really about the resourcing of that local level climate change adaptation. But that we won't see what that looks like probably until 2023 at the earliest. So this is a more bit of a local focus and a bit of an update, because a lot of even stuff's happened in the last month. In the meantime, what are we going to do about our RMA? Because it's still our boss, and it keeps going because people still need to keep developing and building houses and building roads and stuff. The proposed Queenstown Lakes District Plan, I'm going to talk about one potential plan change that's looming called inclusionary zoning, so I'll talk about that next. And the proposed district plan, it's still going through its evolution. There's current plan changes that are being appealed on the industrial zone and the rural visitor zone and the Waihi Te Puna overlay chapter. They're all being mediated. Well, some of them are getting mediated next year in the Environment Court. So there's still a lot of water to go under the bridge before we have a settled district plan. There's, like I said, the council passed approved its spatial plan a few months ago for the whole district, so that it can plan its infrastructure in that sense going forwards. That doesn't have any sort of formal status under the RMA, but it's still relevant to planning. The Otago Regional Council has re-notified a new proposed regional policy statement, mainly because it was criticised in respect of how it dealt with water, but they've re-notified the whole thing. We've only just gone through a proposed regional policy statement process, so it's a little bit frustrating for some of us. So that's been notified, and even before it kind of got off the ground, Forest and Bird have challenged the legitimacy of the process that the Regional Council are taking, because they wanted to use the freshwater planning process for the whole RPS, even though it covers landscape and terrestrial things and soil, so lots of non-freshwater stuff. So that's currently sitting in the High Court, waiting for them to sort out what process they're allowed to do before it can progress. And then there's, my favourite nighttime reading this week, the Enabling Housing Supply and Other Matters Amendment Bill. And for any of you who are sort of keyed into the sort of climate change, emissions reduction space, a couple of weeks ago, the draft emissions reduction plan came out from the government for consultation as well. So really, still a really dynamic space, still lots happening, and a lot of it's still quite relevant, even at this sort of local scale. But for those of you who are involved in land development, this inclusionary zoning potential plan change will be relevant to you. It's not a plan change yet, so you don't need to worry that you're missing a submission deadline, but there was some consultation a month or so ago, and I'm not sure when it's coming up on Council's agenda. It's not on the agenda for the Planning and Strategy Committee today, as far as I can see, but there's another meeting next week of the full Council, and I'm not sure if it's on the agenda for that, because the agenda's not out yet. But it's potentially going to be quite relevant if you are a developer or work for developers. One of the proposals when Council was consulting was that it would potentially use the streamlined planning process under the RMA. That hasn't been used in this district yet. It's yet another of these bespoke processes. It's not, it's not the COVID Recovery Fast Track Act. It's not the Special Housing Area Act. It's another thing. And it's a sort of another one-stop shop where an independent hearing panel is used to have a hearing, allow cross-examination if they want to, and then the outcome of that process, if the council doesn't like it, Minister Parker makes the final decision. And that's the end of it, except for, again, High Court appeals. So if that process is used, that significantly reduces people's ability to take part and to challenge the first instance decision. And it's about ensuring that developments from 2 lots up, effectively, contribute to affordable or community housing. So some of the points that were in the consultation draft is that if you're a residential subdivision within the urban growth boundary, that's the UGB, or a residential zone outside of the UGB, if you're between 2 and 20 lots, a monetary contribution of 5 to 10% of the sale value of the final lots. 20 or more lots, 5 to 10% of serviced lots themselves being contributed for free. In the rural residential zones, resort zones and special zones, a monetary contribution was consulted on as well, 1 to 4% of the sale value, and additional contributions for residential floor space. Now, these were just consulted on. It's not a plan change yet. And then there's this bill that landed this week nationally about enabling housing supply, and it was on the news a bit. Where it's going to definitely affect people is Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga, Wellington and Christchurch. So they're called Tier 1 areas. We're a Tier 2 area here. It could affect us, and we will find out soon if it does. So I'll go into that a bit. But anyway, Tier 1 areas have to use another streamlined planning process that's set out in the bill, pretty similar to what I just described about the inclusionary zoning process. There'll be council have to notify what this bill says they have to notify by August next year. An independent hearing panel considers it, makes recommendations. If the council doesn't like them, I think the minister gets the final say, and only challenge is a judicial review in the High Court. And what they're required to notify by August next year, the bill says, is this thing called medium density residential standards, which is a national set of standards for every residential zone, which is quite extreme, unless you qualify for an exemption. So councils will look at all of their residential zones, look at the sort of lists of exemptions, possible exemptions that are set out in the bill, and go, well, actually, we're not going to notify it for that area because of this reason. And not, so if there's heritage areas or areas that have infrastructure challenges, there'll be good reasons to not notify all your residential zones with this new set of standards. But otherwise, it's pretty extreme, because the medium density residential standards are very enabling. You can go up to 11 metres high. There's height and recession plane things. You can have 50% building coverage of the site area. The outdoor living space requirements are sort of less than your standard thing. And there's outdoor space. Yeah, so basically, really 3 stories, quite dense, is what would be permitted as of right. If you want to do something that's, I presume, less, or no, if you want to do something that's more dense than that, you still need a resource consent. But if you want to do that, once these provisions are notified, you won't need a resource consent if you're in one of these zones. And Tier 2 areas, so Queenstown, the proposal is that I presume there's a discussion between the council and the minister, but if you can convince the minister that your area, or if the minister decides that your area has an acute housing need, which is a defined term in the bill, there'll be an order of council by March next year saying you also got to notify these medium density residential standards for all new residential zones. Oh, and determining whether a district has acute housing need, you have to have regard to the median multiple in the district, calculated according to publicly available data. Because yeah, if Queenstown's got an acute housing need, and probably feels like we probably do still even, or Wanaka, then we could find ourselves in this process. And at the moment in the bill, when these new standards get notified, they will probably have immediate legal effect. So you don't have to wait until a decision has come out. So they'll be notified before August 2022, and they're required to be operative by August 2023. So that's a pretty quick time frame for a pretty big change. Yeah, and that is my last slide.